colleague and I are going to talk a little bit about the economic impact of stranding assets in South Africa. So basically, I think it's probably more of a carbon lock-in problem in South Africa rather than stranding assets. But we were interested in trying to understand what's going to happen if there is climate mitigation policy and it's fair and we do our fair share. What does that do to our economy? Now we had four main research questions. So one, what are we locked into already? So with a nod to Davis and Sokolo, with the infrastructure we have right now, what are we committed to 2050 and how much of our carbon budget does that take up? And then with the different sets of carbon budgets, so if we allocate ourselves X or Y or Z, what is the effect on the South African energy sector of those more stringent carbon budgets and the impact on the economy? What are the impacts of those different carbon budgets on infrastructure utilization, so on power plants, on rail lines, on liquid fuels infrastructure, that sort of thing. And then finally, when you look at these different carbon budgets, how does that compare with our reserves and resources? I'm not a finance person, but maybe it'll be interesting to finance people. So, the South African context, for those who are not familiar, South Africa is highly coal dependent. 65% of our total primary energy supply comes from coal, 90% of our electricity, a third of our liquid fuels come through Sasol's coal to liquids process, so we are very, very kind of embedded in the coal world. It's our third largest export as well, so it's very important for our balance of trade. But we have this odd variance between our emissions per capita and our levels of development, which is also makes stranded assets interesting in South Africa. We don't have any money to spare. So our emissions per capita are sort of similar to the UK, it's 11 tons per capita. But if you look at the levels of poverty and inequality, we're a developing country. A third of the population live on less than $2.50 a day. We're the most unequal country in the world. We have an unemployment rate of 24% or 37% if you include discouraged workers. So very profound development challenges at the same time as a very profound mitigation challenge. This is the South African coal world. This is the Central Basin where most of the electricity generating infrastructure is now. Up north is the Waterberg coal field. At the moment there's only one power station there and one mine, but they're building an Eskom, our state-owned coal utility, is building another power station, almost 5 gigawatts. The Waterberg is linked to the Central Basin with one small railway line, which is being expanded now. They're quadrupling its capacity with a view to kind of expanding our coal industry based around the Waterberg. And that's primarily because of we have about 65 billion tons of coal resources. That was from a national coal inventory. And of that, 35 billion tons are in the Waterberg. Which is a lot of coal. How much of that will actually ever get turned into an asset is unclear. I mean, we have 10 billion tons of actual reserves. 70% of that is in the Central Basin. Only about 3 billion tons are in the Waterberg. This Central Basin is then connected to Richards Bay, where the Richards Bay coal terminal is, with a rail line with a capacity of about 75 million tons, and Transnet, who are our state-owned rail utility, I guess you would call them, they're investing 40 billion rand in expanding that line to 100 million tons. And they see a big coal future. And they're also investing in that Waterberg to Central Basin line, putting it up to 30 million tons, and then with a view to maybe going to 40 or 50 million tons a year. What else are we building? Medupi and Kasilia, the two big 5 gigawatt power stations. We've got 2.5 gigawatts of new coal IPPs, which are out for tender at the moment. There's more gigawatts in our official build plan as well. I've mentioned railway lines. There's ongoing talk about expanding the ports. Lots of new mines. Well, not a lot of new mines actually, I think, because of the coal price, but there is still significant exploration expenditure. I put Anglo in there because it was the only one I could remember off by heart. Sasol, who are the coal to liquids guys, they've invested almost £1 billion over the past 3 years in new mine capacity. And there's a lot of political support. So there's politically connected people in the African National Congress, our main political party, view coal as an important empowerment initiative, so a way of kind of creating growth and creating new capitalists. So there's a lot of political impetus around supporting coal. This just shows you kind of the mitigation problem. These are South Africa's emissions from 2000 to 2010. You can see we emit just over 500 million tons in 2010, and of that, just under 400 million tons are from coal. So for us, mitigation is all about the energy sector. The energy sector in total is 80% of our emissions, and most of the energy sector is coal. So that just gives you a sense of that. Our mitigation policy, this shaded area at the top is our mitigation policy. It's called the Peak Plateau and Decline Trajectory. It's a commitment we made at Copenhagen, and it's also in our domestic policy. And it basically, it's a range because there was an argument about what our business as usual baseline would be for emissions. But it gives you, if you added up, essentially a carbon budget from 2010 to 2050 of 15 to 23 gigatons, which is a lot. It's probably 12 to 20 from 2015 to 2050, which I'll kind of explain. I'll compare now. That'll probably, we're going to reiterate that, I think, in Paris, so we're not going to go much beyond that. So we're looking at 12 to 20 as our committed policy. This lower shaded area takes work from the Potsdam Institute. Basically, they've weighted all the elements of different kind of allocative regimes for the remaining global carbon budget, and this is their range for South Africa. So for a 50% probability of keeping to 2 degrees, they give South Africa a carbon budget of somewhere between 6 and 13 billion tons. So right at the very bottom of our policy basically just matches the top of state-of-the-art allocations internationally. So our fair share that we think we should get is much higher than what the rest of the world thinks we should probably get. Then these 4 lines are our emission scenarios, which we'll talk a little bit about just for comparison. So we modeled a base case of 14 gigaton carbon budget, a 10 and 8. And we look at tightening that, we get down to 8. What is the impact of that on our assets? What kind of stranding are we looking at? But before that, we thought, what are we actually locked into? Like, we had no idea. No one had ever calculated it for South Africa. So we did a relatively simple calculation, and we looked at power plants, vehicles, and upstream liquid fuels. What do we get to? So this is power plants. The blue is our old coal capacity, and we just let it retire according to the official retirement age, which is 50 or 60 years for some of them. It's not 30 years or 40 years like most coal plants. We want to run everything for as long and as hard as we can. But most of it is down by 2050. The orange are our 2 new plants, Medupi and Kusile. They're very delayed, so you can see we try to push out each of those units. And interestingly, like the paper from this morning, lifetime, every year that we pushed them out made quite a big impact on our overall emissions. That's one of the key things, was lifetimes. So you can see as they retire, our cumulative emissions increase. And from the power sector alone, we get to 6.6 billion tons of just CO2, not CO2 equivalents. If you do the same for the vehicle fleet, and interestingly enough in South Africa, vehicles are not short-lived assets. Of the vehicles that come online in 2015, 6% of them will still be running in 2050. Same thing, we run everything long and hard. So this is vehicle tailpipe emissions. It's 550 million tons over the period. Once you include Sasol and the refineries and the upstream liquid fuels, you get to almost 850 million tons. So before we've built a single new piece of infrastructure, South Africa is going to use 7.5 gigatons of its somewhere between 6 and 13 fair share as an indication. So how does that tie back to what we did? We've got something called the South African Times Energy Model, SATM. It's a full energy sector model, and you can run you can kind of run almost anything you want. It's like a wonderful black box. If you're a modeler, you know. And it's a least cost optimization model, so it will always meet projected future energy demand subject to whatever constraints you want to place on it, like a carbon constraint or water constraint. And you put in all your assumptions about retirement dates, future fuel costs, technology learning. So it accounts for all of those things. It has learning for solar, that kind of thing, and it tries to build you the cheapest energy system that you can have going forward. And we did 4 scenarios so that we could get a sense of what would be stranded under a more stringent carbon budget. In our base case, we just let the model optimize, no carbon constraints, and you end up with 17.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalent between 2015 and 2050. It builds quite a lot of coal. But interestingly, towards the end of the period, it also builds quite a lot of solar. So there starts to be an actual technological kind of competition there. We then did an 8, 10 and 14 gigaton scenarios, which we compare, and my colleague Tara is just going to compare those for you.
So I can tell you now that the model is not a black box, because we had someone from policy and very detail orientated question every single one of our assumptions going into the model. So this is some of the findings that we got. At the moment, you're looking at the installed capacity for the power sector, and I'll take you through them quickly. This is the base case that we have. So you can see existing coal is coming offline, and we're just replacing it with basically the same amount of new coal. And as Jason said, solar thermal starts to become more competitive, and we built a little bit more of that going forward. And if you compare that to the 8 gigaton, you can see we go from just over 40 gigawatts of installed capacity to over 160 gigawatts of installed capacity. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is because we have a lot more renewables online in 2050. And obviously with availability factors, you have to build a lot more to get the same amount of terawatt hours out of the system in the end. The second reason is because of peak demand. And you can see peak demand, which is the red line going up, is a lot higher than in the base. And this is because under a very stringent carbon constraint, sectors are having to move away from direct coal use to decarbonized electricity. So that's what's going on here. And so it's quite interesting, but you can't really tell a story about stranded assets in this, because it's basically the same retiring coal-fired plants. But if you look at our next graph here, you can see the stranding of assets. So in the 8 gigaton scenario, post-2025, we have no coal-fired plants. So this is Medupi and Caetano, which have only been running for between 5 to 10 years, depending on which units you're looking at, completely stranded. That's $30 billion worth of coal-fired plants. So quite a striking difference, I think, if you look at the actual electricity coming out versus what's actually installed. So next we look at liquid fuels, and this is for the base case here. So JC mentioned Sasol, which is the little bar and the red bar. So we allow Sasol to live out its full life to 2035. And we get some more new CTL coming in the Waterberg. Also some existing coal refinery capacity, as well as some imports coming in. And when we ran this for the 8 gigaton scenario, we had no more Sasol post-2025. Sasol is completely stranded. And we replaced this mostly with imports, as well as more utilization of our existing crude refinery capacity. And this is our export rail. So JC was talking about the railway line from the Central Basin down to our coal terminal in Richards Bay. So this blue line on the top here is the actual expansion plan. So what we're planning to have in terms of rail capacity. So it's about 97.5 or 98 million tons of coal throughput by 2020. And the bar graphs below that is the actual utilization. So with coal prices, so the coal export price that we estimated using IEA data, as well as some data from McKinsey, we're just not competitive, really. So we don't utilize all those coal resources. And it's also competing with domestic coal use. So some of that export grade coal is used by industry. And you can see here towards the end, by 2040, in the 8 and the 10 gigaton scenario, industry is moving away from coal use. And they're actually using more expensive natural gas options. Back to total coal resource utilization. JC mentioned that there's 10 gigatons of actual reserves in South Africa. And in our base case, we use roughly 7 gigatons of what we have available. This drops quite substantially if you look at the 8 gigaton constraint to only 2 gigatons of actual coal being used in South Africa. So substantial underutilization of reserves. And as South Africa's third largest export, this could do some serious damage to our balance trade. Okay, so now to some socioeconomic analysis. What does this actually mean we can't look at this without any feedback into the economy. You know, this is going to be massive price hikes, electricity price hikes. And what does this actually do to growth in the economy? So what we did was we linked just the electricity sector with the CGE model. The full energy link is still ongoing, but we hope to do more work on that when we have the models actually talking to each other properly. So electricity investment and price. What you're seeing here on the left is actual annual investment costs for the electricity sector to 2050. And this 160 billion rand is basically 5% of our GDP spent in 1 year, only on electricity capacity. So that's huge. And this is what it does to the price. So you can see it peaks at about 102 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to the 14 gigaton scenario where it peaks at about 74 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's already quite an expensive build plan. So what does this actually do to growth? How do sectors respond to this electricity price? And this here is exactly what we would expect. So our electricity intensive sectors tank, basically. Aluminium and platinum, there's no case to be made for actually smelting in South Africa. So you see it's huge decreases in growth in those sectors. But also, if you look here on the left with agriculture, if we use our regional trade to our best advantage, which is what we expect to happen over the next few years if people actually want our exports, we can grow quite significantly in agriculture. And it's a difficult argument to make because no one wants to hear about deindustrialization, really. But, I mean, this could be an opportunity for low carbon growth, as well as development in South Africa, because this could soak up our really low skilled labor in the country. So just a few conclusions. As Jessie showed, our committed emissions are already very high. So we have to think carefully about investments in very carbon intensive infrastructure. And as you can see, the socio-economic consequences of stranding assets could be huge. And this is even with assumed export demand, you know. So if we had an 8 gigaton scenario, it's probably because the rest of the world is not going to be using coal anymore. There would be no reason for us to constrain our economy when no one else is. So would we even have any demand for our coal elsewhere in the world? And also, we don't believe that the 8 gigaton scenario is actually feasible given our current economic and political climate. However, we should look further at the 10 to 12 gigaton scenarios. And the last point was an unwillingness to strand assets is likely to lead to South Africa overshooting our global